Shocking, but familiar. Another mass shooting in America. A gunman kills 19 school children in a small town in Texas. President Joe Biden says it's time to act, but can the U.S. ever change its gun laws? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Robb elementary school shooting. Last week on this very program, we covered the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. And once again, America's controversial relationship with guns is under scrutiny. On Tuesday, an 18-year-old man walked into Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, armed with a semi-automatic rifle, a handgun, and body armor. It took more than 90 minutes after the first shot was reported for police to kill the gunman. In that time, 21 people were killed, 19 children and 2 teachers. In a sadly and now familiar routine, U.S. President Joe Biden condemned the attack and pleaded with lawmakers to stand up to the gun lobby.
Good evening, fellow Americans. I had hoped when I became president I would not have to do this again. Another massacre, Uvalde, Texas. An elementary school. Beautiful, innocent, 2nd, 3rd, 4th graders. And how many scores of little children who witness what happened see their friends die as if they're on a battlefield, for God's sake. We have to act. And don't tell me we can't have an impact on this carnage.
Well, in the U.S., there are actually more guns than people, at a ratio of 120 per 100 Americans. The country also has the shameful distinction of having more mass shootings than any other nation. In 2022 alone, more than 200 mass shootings have taken place across the U.S. That's an average of 10 every week. 27 of them have been school shootings. And so far this year alone, more than 17,000 people have died from gun violence. Well, schools are supposed to be a safe place for children, but since the 1970s, there have been more than 2,000 school shootings. Here are just some of the more recent ones.
On April the 20th, 1999, 2 teenagers shot and killed 12 of their fellow students and 1 teacher at Columbine High School in Colorado before committing suicide. Police also discovered handmade explosives inside the school. 8 years later, 32 people were gunned down on the campus of Virginia Tech by Sung Hee Choi. The 23-year-old then turned the weapon on himself. In 2012, a 20-year-old fatally shot 20 children and 6 staff at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut. It's gone down as the deadliest elementary school shooting in U.S. history. On February the 14th, 2018, an expelled student from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida shot and killed 17 people, including 13 children. 3 months later, a 17-year-old student from Santa Fe High School in Texas killed 8 of his classmates and 2 teachers.
Staggering numbers. And as you saw from that report, the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut was one of the worst. Chris Murphy is a lawmaker from that district. He's spent the last decade pleading for gun control, and here he is slamming his fellow senators for failing to take action.
What are we doing? What are we doing? Just days after a shooter walked into a grocery store to gun down African-American patrons, we have another Sandy Hook on our hands. What are we doing? There have been more mass shootings than days in the year. Our kids are living in fear every single time they set foot in a classroom because they think they're going to be next. What are we doing? Why do you spend all this time running for the United States Senate? Why do you go through all the hassle of getting this job of putting yourself in a position of authority, if your answer is that as this slaughter increases, as our kids run for their lives, we do nothing, what are we doing? Why are you here? If not to solve a problem as existential as this.
But there are differing views on what needs to be done. In fact, some argue more guns, not fewer, could have prevented this tragedy. Just listen to Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton speaking to Fox News.
There's no doubt if somebody there had been armed, if several people had been armed and trained, there would have been the potential to eliminate some of the loss that we had yesterday. And that in the end is the goal.
Now, for much of the world, it sounds absurd to say that more firearms would make people safer, but that is often the argument made by the pro-gun lobby in the United States. So can anything be done to curb mass shootings in America? Joining me now to debate that is from Chicago, Gary Slutkin. He is the founding CEO and director of Cure Violence Global. Alan Linton also joins us from Chicago. He's the director of diversity and inclusion at the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. And from Washington, Bruce DelValle, a constitutional law expert at Fein and DelValle. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, Bruce, let me start with you because I get asked regularly, having grown up in the United States, why so many Americans are just so attached to guns, you know, to the point where they're willing to put public safety at grave risk in order to protect gun ownership, which in many cases is really just for hobby, actually. Can you explain?
Well, thank you very much. That is a very good question. It's a question I often get asked. I think the explanation from a historic and perhaps constitutional perspective is that Americans love life, their life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness so much that they created a government more or less out of whole cloth. It was a great social experiment that let them protect their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They created a government that would permit them to do so. And that's in the Constitution. That's why it's in the Bill of Rights in the Second Amendment. Now, I will tell you, over time, the Second Amendment has come to be interpreted much differently than was originally interpreted and for most of the history of this country. And I think that's where the problem lies.
Right, because let's look at the Second Amendment. It clearly states the right to bear arms as a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. So where's the militia here when these are all privately owned guns we're talking about? And how is it even necessary for the security of a free state when it's putting the public at risk?
Well, that's a great question again, because what happened was until 2007 and the Supreme Court decision of Washington, D.C. versus Heller, it was always seen as a collective right. Most of the articles written about the Second Amendment saw it and viewed it as a collective right. Slowly over time, mostly because of the NRA and gun interest groups, people use the word gun lobby. I think that's a somewhat deceptive term. There isn't really a gun lobby. It has now shifted. It's a paradigm. American opinion has changed, or at least perceptions of American opinion have changed. But it has always been seen historically as a collective right until 2007. And in 2007, Justice Scalia, ironically enough, who was the strict constructionist, somehow read in those words that there's an individual right to gun ownership. And that cemented and institutionalized the concept of where we are now. Back in 1939, there was a famous Supreme Court decision, the Miller decision, where the Supreme Court said, you know, sawed-off shotguns are not necessary to a well-regulated militia. They don't serve any Second Amendment purpose because they're not necessary for militia purposes. So there are more decisions, or historically were more decisions that saw it as a collective right. We are now, the last 15 years, in an era where it's looked at as an individual right. And I think if anything needs to be changed, and certainly something does, we need to go back and revisit Heller or amend the Second Amendment, which will be almost impossible.
Right. But I mean, now you have a Supreme Court that has a hard right conservative majority. I mean, that will be harder than ever to try to do. But Gary, let me turn to you. You know, the reason I asked this question to begin with, because as I said, I get asked it a lot living outside of the U.S. Bruce even gets asked it living inside the country. I had a father, for example, who was a gun collector, and the only explanation I could really get was I have these guns because I can, because I'm an American. The question of, the public interest never entered into the equation. It was more about me, what I want. So, I mean, Gary, do you have any other kind of explanation for how Americans, unlike almost anywhere else in the world, have this fixation on the right to bear arms?
Well, the way you explained and described your father and his attitude, in a way, is very general in America. I can do what I want, and it's not for anybody to interfere with that. And so I'm not now speaking about laws, I'm speaking about the culture. And we saw this also with COVID, is that people said, you can't tell me to wear a mask because it's for the general good. I'm going to do what I want to do, and you can't inhibit me. And that individualistic culture is very connected to the environment in which violence is occurring. And
Right.
it crosses races and ethnic groups and everything. And it's an aggressive culture. America has an aggressive culture.
And Gary, you actually, though, have an organization that's dedicated to violence reduction. I mean, tell us then what's actually worked in what you've done, and I mean, can it be scaled?
Right. So yeah, it is being scaled. So our work, Cure Violence, the work of Cure Violence has been largely focused on community violence. And we see violence, we understand violence as a contagious problem. In fact, as a contagious disease. Meets the definition of disease, meets the definition of contagious. One event leads to another. And we're seeing this with school shootings also. Once there's an event, there's more likely to be additional events that copy it. And this is the human brain at work copying behaviors that it sees. So violence relates to exposure and to susceptibility, and you have a very susceptible population in America, and you have a lot of exposure to violence, just like COVID, a lot of exposure and a lot of susceptibility. So what we do is we basically roll out the epidemic control playbook, which means detecting and interrupting events that occur. And so in communities, and we're now working in 30 communities, over 100 communities, but 30 cities in the U.S., in about 8 or so countries in Latin America. We have some work in the Middle East, most of it working on community violence. We have what people know as violence interrupters, who can detect and interrupt an event from happening because they have access and credibility and trust with the people who are about to do a shooting. And they can persuade people after having been trained to stop a shooting.
Okay.
And this approach is 40 to 70% effective in stopping shootings and killings.
I appreciate the work you've done, but I mean, unfortunately, when we look at the wider United States, we see that these efforts just aren't making a big enough dent in the problem of gun violence as of yet. That's why I said if you can scale it, I mean, at a massive level, we might see, better results. But we still have, and Ellen,
Right.
let me turn to you. Bruce, I know you don't like the gun lobby, but just for sake of the lack of a better term, they constantly argue a few things, but that it's not, Alan, it's not a gun issue, it's a mental health issue. Or guns don't kill people kill people. But I mean, explain how you can't separate the two, and that someone with a mental illness in the United States, and because of the Second Amendment, we have to remind our viewers, has an equal right to bear arms. You cannot discriminate against a mentally ill person and take away their constitutional right because they suffer from depression or schizophrenia. The ACLU, Bruce, maybe you don't agree, but has argued successfully that you cannot discriminate against other Americans. So, Alan,
Certainly that-
yeah, let me get to Ellen
That
first,
argument's out
though.
there, yeah,
Right,
yeah.
about the issue of mental health in the United States and how it fits in with the devastation, how it causes the devastation because of the right to bear arms.
Well, I think it's multifaceted. I think certainly there is a chronic systemic mental health set of challenges here in the United States, but I don't think it's unique to the rest of the world. I think the accelerant if you will, here is the access to guns. You have a country that has 120 guns per 100 Americans. And so the proliferation of guns, whether it's at a community level or the availability of firearms, high capacity, deadly weapons, and the access to get them very easily without the necessary background checks in many places, without the necessary protocols to ensure that the appropriate people are getting appropriate arms, leads to a situation where the long-term solutions to mental health, to community support, to eliminating some of the fear and anger that's embedded across this country for any number of reasons, it's accelerated, and bad things can happen because of the availability of arms. Let's be clear, in Texas, the shooter turned 18 and immediately purchased large-scale assault rifles. There is no practical purpose, to my eye and to the eye of many people, experts and folks across the country, why someone should have that. There's no safety argument. There's no well-regulated militia argument. But when you have this availability of arms and a culture that celebrates the individual and also puts blame on the individual, you can endure an epidemic of gun violence without thinking of collective solutions.
Right. I mean, Ellen, what do you think of when you look at countries like New Zealand that basically had one mass shooting and immediately instituted a program to outlaw guns and buy back all the weapons that were already in circulation so that gun owners couldn't say, hey, you can't just take my property away. They said, no, we'll pay you for it. But now this is a blanket protection for all of our society. We're getting guns out of the hands of private individuals so that everyone is safer. I mean, do Americans, I don't know, do they care less about American lives than New Zealanders do about their own?
I think there's a difference in the collective. I think there's a lot of talk in the United States about the neighbor, the us, the united part of the United States. But in practical terms, there is a sense of bad people do bad things. And if you isolate the bad people, then you'll have a society that works. And clearly, over and over again, there's this warped idea that people twisting themselves in the knots, frankly, to try to justify different or alternative solutions when we have across the globe, to your point, a very simple solution. If you address the amount of guns available and reduce them, then you can actually start to reduce these massive shootings that happen every day, every week, and frankly, people get numb to.
Right. Bruce, I know you had a comment on what I'd said earlier, but I need to ask you this as well. I mean, the question of these semi-automatic weapons. You know, there was a very good PSA campaign, public advertising, saying, you know, guns have changed since 1789 when the Second Amendment was written. Shouldn't gun laws? I mean, if this was written in 1789, why are we only allowed to bear muskets? I believe we actually have that ad. It was extremely effective. Unfortunately, it didn't get a wide amount of play. But I mean, that is the question. Why have guns been able to change and our gun laws have not?
That's interesting. I had that very discussion a few weekends ago. I was at a shooting range, and that topic was brought up. Someone said, look over there. The founding fathers didn't know about those. And I said, you're exactly right. I will tell you, I have no tolerance or no time for assault weapons. I grew up hunting. My exposure to guns was always relating to hunting, rural living. I don't see any reason that anyone in the citizenry should own an assault rifle. I don't believe they are necessary for any purposes that guns are necessary for, whatever argument you make, any more than I believe it's proper for an American to own an F-16 or a tank, an armed tank or a howitzer. So what we need to do, what's happening here, and your guess is very correct. Everywhere in the world, there are people that are aggressive. Everywhere in the world, there are people that have mental illness that may cause harm to themselves or to others. Everywhere in the world, there are bigots. Everywhere in the world, there are racists and extremists. The difference is here in America, the access to deadly weapons is much easier than anywhere in the world. I will countervail that by pointing out a fact that is absolutely true, and most people don't recognize it. We are the only nation in the history of the world where the government has not turned on its citizenry. It's never happened. Is it because we're an armed citizenry? I don't know, but that is a fact that cannot be disregarded. So what we have to do is start looking at solutions from the root, from the Second Amendment. Most of the things that the Democrats, if you want to break it down to Democrats and Republicans, the anti-gun, the virulent anti-gun folks are proposing only relate to new sales of new guns. We already have so many guns proliferating. There's estimated to be something like 400 million. And I will tell you, it's now to a tipping point on an unexpected side where the criminals really, really want the guns to be taken away from non-criminals. Because criminals are like lions. They pick on the weak. If they know you have a gun, they're not going to come to your house. It just doesn't work that way. That is not a justification. It is a social reality. What we need to do
they
is
might come to your house anyway.
They
Especially
may,
when you have the opioid epidemic, for example, in the United States. You know, you got a lot of people that are using hard drugs and also, again, as mental illness, they're not making considered decisions when they commit crimes.
That's very true. But even the shooter in Texas ran away and ran into the school. And he ran away from the armed folks and he barricaded himself. You're right. That is a very erudite argument to a too broad statement. But what I think we need to start doing is reframe the argument, much like abortion. The abortion argument has been reframed in the American public's eye, and the American public has gone and examined something that the Supreme Court said you get. And now we're to the point where they're saying, you don't really get it. You get it, but there's going to be some controls over it. And I think that's part of our history. At one time, slavery was okay. The Supreme Court said slavery is okay. And then it was determined that that is really not okay, and that's not going to happen anymore. I think the American people should ask their politicians to not grandstand, not make political speeches, not make knee-jerk reactions, and engage in a legitimate response to how do we re-examine the Second Amendment in a way that makes sense. I don't think there should be a federal law. I think each state should be free to make their own decisions. That's the abortion argument, the anti-abortion argument. And I think that the regulation of weapons in the hands of individuals should be back in the hands of the government, and that the right should be seen as a collective right. And that there is a difference between an AR-15 and a squirrel gun.
We're down to our last couple minutes, though. I want to get, Alan and Gary, just for a couple more minutes. You know, we also, as we said before, we have a Supreme Court now that has a hard right conservative majority, and many are saying that gun rights, Gary, could even be expanded. That is the ultimate voice in U.S. legislation. If the Supreme Court makes a decision, it does become law. And so, Gary, I'll start with you. Where do you think this is going?
I mean, it's not going in a good direction, not just for mass shootings, but for community violence and many other forms. So it's really the way that we're thinking that needs to change. I mean, if we say, you know, we're making very rational arguments about assault weapons and their availability, but people want them. I mean, people are able to get things. You can make it harder, and we can get a 30% drop. And that's what was shown with the banning of assault weapons. But the culture really needs to shift. And when you say, is it the guns or the culture is asking for the guns. And so the culture really needs to change. And the culture, I'm not saying this very generally, I'm saying it very specifically as a result, relates to violence.
Okay.
You know, it's a behavioral issue, and that needs what we in the academic world call universal training and public education, as well as outreach and caring for each other in a different way than we are now.
Okay, I mean, Alan, yeah, you're hearing they're talking about changing the culture, but still, laws can be laws. So you can work at kind of community level to try and change the culture, but if the laws on the books, especially as determined by the highest court in the land, continue to keep these free gun ownership laws in place as liberal and as they are, where do you see this going?
Well, sadly, I think it's going to be more of the same. We've had politicians attacked, we've had schools attacked, we've had churches attacked, we've had entertainment, concerts, movie theaters, grocery stores, and nothing changes. Politicians aren't punished. attack on the Capitol. You have politicians that aren't punished for not addressing gun laws, and you have a reactionary society that wants action today, but 2 weeks from now, is it going to be top of mind? The risk will still be there. The guns will still be there. But right now, you have an inability to act and, frankly, an inability to push for greater action. We're having a conversation about common sense reform. There's polling out there that shows, 90% support for background check among gun owners, reasonable restrictions, and somehow, some way, the fear and anger and the balance, the fear of taking guns away and I need to buy more guns, the fear of someone going to attack me, I need to buy more guns. That fear of the other, fear of a theoretical concern leads to more guns and, frankly, more harm, whether it be suicides by firearms, community violence, or mass shooting. The end result in this country is inaction and more violence and a deadly cycle that is disappointing, it's disheartening, but decidedly American and really, quite frankly, baked into the American culture. It is the worst type of American exceptionalism on display.
And the downward spiral will continue, from what I'm hearing from this panel, so sadly. Alan Linton, Gary Slutkin, Bruce DelValle, thank you all so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Great to have you. And our viewers, of course, as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.